During the 1940s, in the midst of World War II, word began to reach the West of the persecution of Jews. Once the war ended, the truth of the horrors of the concentration camps and the murder of 6 million Jews was exposed to the world. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish people in those concentration camps were freed. Many were sickly, starving, and most had no home to go to. The Jewish community in the United States were desperate to have the U.S. become involved, but all of President Truman's advisors strongly advised not to become involved. Welcome to Israel Unveiled. I'm really glad you could join me today. This is the second of 2 parts about unusual relationships that helped change the world and laid the foundation for the birth of the State of Israel. In the first podcast, I talked about Reverend William Heckler, a Gentile Christian, and the relationship with Hungarian Jew Theodor Herzl, and the impact that they had on the establishment of the Jewish state. A few years ago, my husband and I were visiting our son and his family in Kansas City. And so one afternoon, we decided that we would tour the Truman Presidential Library in Independence. And while I was there, I picked up a little book about his life. And it's that book that introduced me to a friendship that really did change the course of events in history. It was about 2 men, and they couldn't have been more different. The first was Eddie Jacobson. He was the grandson of an impoverished Jewish Lithuanian immigrant, and he came to America because he was fleeing the Russian army. That immigrant's son became a hardworking tailor, and he supported his 6 children. There were 4 boys and 2 girls. Eddie was one of those sons, and he was born in 1895 in New York's East Side. When Eddie was 7, the family moved to Kansas City, Missouri, and they became part of the Reform Judaism community that was there in Kansas. The other man, Harry Truman, came from very different roots. He was from a strong Protestant background whose descendants were the Scottish, Irish, and English settlers of Kansas and Missouri, who all farmed the land. And he would become the 33rd president of the United States. It was during World War I that both men from Kansas City area met. Both served together in France. Harry became a captain and commander of the 35th Division. In Eddie, Harry recognized someone who was gifted in organization and could open and could run a much-needed canteen for the men that were in that unit. And they found that they really worked well together, and they formed a deep, lasting friendship that would be forged for a lifetime. At the end of the war, they both moved back home, and they married their sweethearts. Together, the 2 men decided that they would open up a men's clothing store, and they named it Truman and Jacobson Haberdashery. Initially, it went very well. It worked out so well. Eddie did the buying for the shop, and Harry would do the bookkeeping. And the store was very successful. But sadly, the Great Depression hit. And people no longer had the money to buy new clothes. And so what happened is the two of them went into debt, and they were forced to close the store. Both Harry and Eddie found some other work because they were determined that they were going to pay off that debt. Eddie, after working for a number of years as a salesman, would eventually be able to open his own clothing store. Meanwhile, Harry entered local politics, and he won his first election as an Eastern judge of Jackson County, Missouri. And he served several terms as judge. His work ethic, honesty, and plain speaking paved the way for his rise in the U.S. Congress as senator from Missouri. And he began his first term in 1935. Along the way, he and Eddie continued to remain close friends. And Eddie actually helped in Harry's political campaigns whenever he could. And as often as they could, they'd meet for lunch and for a night of cards with their former Army buddies. In all that time, Eddie never sought any kind of favor from his best friend, Harry. During the 1940s, in the midst of World War II, word began to reach the West of the persecution of Jews. No one could have imagined the horror that was taking place in Europe under the Nazis at that time. Not Eddie Jacobson at home in Missouri, nor Senator Harry Truman in Washington, D.C. Franklin Delano Roosevelt served as president throughout the war. He was first elected during the Great Depression in 1933. By the end of his third four-year term, he was exhausted, and he was obviously very ill. It was important that he would choose a running mate who might be faced with the challenge of finishing Roosevelt's final four-year term if he won. And he did. Harry Truman was selected to be his running mate and was sworn in as Vice President of the United States on January 20th, 1945. Only 82 days later, President Roosevelt died, and Harry Truman became president to a nation in a world war for 2 more months. Once the war ended, the truth of the horrors of the concentration camps and the murder of 6 million Jews was exposed to the world, and hundreds of thousands of Jewish people in those concentration camps as survivors were freed. Many were sickly, starving, and on the brink of death. And most had no home to go to. 5,000 Jewish communities in Europe had actually been annihilated. The Jewish community in the United States were desperate to have the U.S. become involved in helping in this growing tragedy. But all of President Truman's advisors, as well as those in the State Department and the Defense Department, strongly advised not to become involved. They said that the nation was tired from 4 years of fighting in a costly war. And now the soldiers and all of the people who were involved in the war effort just wanted to come home and rebuild their own lives and to return to some kind of normal. Again, the Jewish American community made another appeal to the president. In their desperation, they even promised Jewish support and votes in future elections, as well as financial help in the financing of his future campaigns. Truman was offended that any American would try to influence him as he saw it in that way. He would let others take care of the Jews of Europe. He became the brunt then of slander and even hatred from the desperate Jewish leaders for his lack of help. And this made him more resolute, and the door was firmly shut to any more appeals. In the midst of all of this, another great issue was presenting itself before the world. In President Truman's third year of his presidency, the world was ready to honor a promise that had been made during World War I to establish a homeland for the Jews that had been presented and passed and acknowledged in the Balfour Declaration of 1917. It would need to be ratified by a United Nations vote that was coming before that international body. Support for the United States and the influence that it had on other nations was crucial for a yes vote in order to pass that resolution. At that point, the United States was not in support and would vote no. President Truman was firm in his decision. The Jewish community and those who supported the promise of a Jewish homeland were desperate, but they had faced a door that was firmly closed to the office of the president. After all, he felt he had been slandered by the Jews in America. If only the president could meet, they felt, and hear Dr. Chaim Weizmann, a hero who was to many people in the Jewish community and the world. He was a man respected for the help that he had given to the Allies in World War I. As a chemist, he had discovered the process to produce acetone, a propellant that was used in the making of ammunition, and that was desperately needed by the British. Well, Dr. Weizmann gave them the formula, his discovery, and he was a man forever honored for it. So the problem was how to get Dr. Weizmann an audience with President Truman. Surely he would be able to explain the dire situation and hopefully change the president's mind. One of the leaders in the national Jewish community remembered that President Harry Truman, had a Jewish friend who he'd gone to war with, who he'd been in business with, and whom he had maintained a close relationship. And that man was Eddie Jacobson. Eddie was contacted, and he was told that he was their last hope to reach the president. Eddie agreed. He was willing to risk a lifelong relationship with his dear friend. And he went to Washington, and he literally just walked in to the president's office, relying on his friendship and the fact that he had never asked his friend for any favor in all their years of friendship. He made an emotional appeal, asking President Truman to just listen to Dr. Chaim Weizmann. Finally, after much emotional back and forth, President Truman finally relented, and he declared to his friend, "You win, you bald-headed SOB. I'll see him." And Dr. Weizmann was granted an audience with the President of the United States. In that meeting, Dr. Weizmann made his case for a yes vote in the UN for the Partition Plan. The President listened, and at the conclusion of the meeting, his mind was changed. He pledged his support for the upcoming UN Partition Plan that would allow for the creation of the Jewish state. In addition, President Truman personally used his influence with other nations to build support for that UN Resolution 181 that did pass on November 30th, 1947. It took 80 years to finally establish what the international body had promised back in 1917. Less than a year later, on May 14th, 1945, the State of Israel was declared, and 11 minutes later, the United States of America, under President Truman, was the first country to give diplomatic recognition. History had placed a Jewish man, owner of a clothing store in Kansas City, Missouri, and his Christian friend, fondly known as the Man from Missouri, to play a pivotal role in the establishment of the State of Israel. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. And if you did, and you'd like to see other podcasts like it, if you would please click like and share. I hope you'll also click subscribe to see other podcasts. Be blessed and shalom.